This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
With the first time the red light comes on when it's on, and it's that same button on the right.
Good morning. Can I welcome everyone to the Police and Crime Committee meeting? This morning we will be discussing the police investigation of serious injury collisions in London. So please can you make sure that your electronic devices are switched to silent mode to avoid any interruptions? And can I now ask our clerk, Lauren Harvey, if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies for absence have been received from Assembly Member Moema, for whom, and Assembly Member Ahmad, for whom Assembly Member Cooper is attending as a substitute.
Thank you. And can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interests to declare? Noted. Can we confirm the minutes of the meeting held on 31st October 2023 to be signed by me as a correct record? Can we note the outstanding actions arising from previous meetings and the additional correspondence received? Noted. And can we note the response received from the Department of Health and Social Care to the committee's joint letter with the Health Committee on London Ambulance Service funding? Noted. So we now move on to our main item of business. And I would like to welcome our guests. We have Amy Aeron-Thomas, who is the Traffic Justice Co-ordinator from Action Vision Zero. Welcome, Amy. We have Victoria Lebrec, who is Collision Investigation Campaign Coordinator at Action Vision Zero. Welcome, Victoria. We have Nick Simmons, who is Chief Executive from RoadPeace. Welcome. We have Rory McCarron, who is a Senior Associate Solicitor from Leigh. Welcome. And we have Dushal Mehta, who is a Specialist Personal Injury Solicitor at Field Fisher. And we're joined on Zoom by Jami Blythe, who is a Development Manager at Break. Welcome to you, Jami, as well. So I think it's a kind of just recently we've just had last weekend that moment of remembering all the people who have been killed and seriously injured on our roads. And in 2022, it's worth remembering that there were 23,465 collisions reported to the police. And of those, 102 people were sadly killed. 3,859 people were seriously injured. And 23,246 people were slightly injured on London's roads. So these collisions are affecting many Londoners' lives and are the kind of the ripple effect, even of something that might be slight, like a broken ankle, can actually have huge implications for someone if they can't continue to work, if they then can't continue to pay their rent. These are incidents that have a huge impact on Londoners. So I'm very grateful to all of you for coming here today to give us some more background into all of this. So my first question, which I'm going to ask to each of you, is sort of really fundamental. It's sort of, why is the police investigation of serious injury collisions important? And also, if you could reflect on how the investigation of serious injury collisions impacts road crash victims and their families. So I don't know who wants to go first. Victoria, shall I let you go first?
Yes, thank you very much. I should say that I myself was very seriously injured in a crash in 2014, and I lost my leg as a result of that collision. So I've been through this process, and I understand the impact very personally. I've also met a lot of people since my crash has happened who've been in road collisions and have suffered very serious injuries. In terms of the impact on people's lives, the collision investigation is incredibly important, because without a good collision investigation, there's no criminal prosecution that's possible. So we're not deterring bad drivers or punishing bad drivers, and we're also not able to get bad drivers off the roads with driving bans. So if the police aren't collecting evidence, no criminal prosecution is possible. So that's one very important point. The second point is that civil compensation is much more difficult if there's not a quality collision investigation. So if CCTV evidence isn't gathered, if witness statements aren't taken, we've got a fault-based compensation system in the UK. We've got to be able to prove liability for people to get access to compensation which they need for rehabilitation. In my case, I've got to pay now for prosthetic legs. They're incredibly expensive. They cost like £70,000 if you want to get a really top-of-the-range prosthetic leg. If I hadn't been able to, if I hadn't had such a good investigation that was conducted by the Serious Collisions Investigation Unit, I would struggle to then, I wouldn't have been able to access that money, and I would struggle to be able to pay for the medical care that I need. So it's incredibly important on that front. And the final reason why collision investigations are so important is that if the police don't investigate crashes properly, we don't know what the reasons are that are causing these crashes. We don't know what the contributory factors are. There was some work done by the Metropolitan Police, I think it was in 2020, where they reviewed all of the fatal collisions that had happened, and they reviewed the contributory factors as part of those fatal collisions. In the data, the official data, speeding was listed as a contributory factor in 16% of collisions. Once they reviewed those investigation reports, it was found to be 49%. So collision investigation is very important to understand what is happening and what the causes are of crashes, and that's very important for Transport for London and the Met to be able to deliver on Vision Zero. If we don't know what's causing collisions, then we can't properly put in place policies which address that. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Jami online so that you don't feel left out. So, Jami, if you would like to answer the question, why is the police investigation of serious injury collisions important, and how does the investigation of serious injury collisions impact road crash victims and their families?
Thank you, Chair. So I think it would be really helpful just to give you a little bit about my background. Prior to coming to work with Brake, I was a roads policing officer up in the north of England. So for 20 years I was really responsible for attending and investigating fatal and serious injury collisions, and I was also a family liaison officer, so I understand how incredibly complex this landscape is, and I've also seen firsthand the impact of investigations on individuals and families, both who've been bereaved and seriously injured. I think from a Brake perspective, we run the National Road Victim Service. We receive referrals for support, practical and emotional support for bereaved and the most seriously injured individuals into our service through our caseworker team. So really it's a daily occurrence that we are witnessing the impact of the length of investigations, the length of time that it takes the police to investigate collisions and find outcomes for those individuals. Those very lengthy waits can really exacerbate the trauma that the individuals and families are facing, and it really slows down their ability to cope and recover from what they've experienced, no matter what that level of injury is. That statement comes with a huge amount of sympathy for the incredible hard work that our frontline emergency services do when they attend and investigate collision scenes. It is absolutely painstaking, I know, because I did that job for 20 years. It's only right and proper that those investigations are thorough, so that there is no ambiguity around answers. So the lengthy waits are unfortunately a bit of a perfect storm of a lack of resourcing, probably a lack of investment in roads policing and collision investigation, and the very nature of those, as I say, painstaking and thorough investigations. So it is the impact that we see we in our National Road Victim Service, where we support people who are very seriously injured, is really around that ability to cope and waiting for answers. That's the main issue that we see. I think the pathway into support is actually key to this discussion, because the understanding of Metropolitan Police and other police forces around what support is available, that practical and emotional support that people so desperately need, has to be fixed, I suppose. It is a bit of a postcode lottery at the moment. So that's one piece of really crucial work that I think needs to be undertaken. We work with a panel of lawyers within the National Road Victim Service. They are all specialist lawyers, personal injury lawyers, who do some incredible work with families. I think there was a lot of myth busting we need to do about personal injury claims, but being able to access that incredible support through personal injury lawyers for the people that we support in the National Road Victim Service is also key to this discussion.
Thank you very much. That's a really helpful outline from you. So I'm going to move to this end of the panel and work back. So Dushal, do you want to contribute?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So obviously, as a personal injury solicitor, we are involved in helping victims and their families at an early stage. And I'd like to echo what Victoria has already said, which is the early investigatory work is so important to the families and the victims that we act for. Often there are so many questions that they have about what has happened. Sometimes they're unaware of what has happened because of the extent of their injuries. Obviously, what we would like is for the police to carry out a thorough investigation, but to share as much information as they possibly can with us at an early stage, not to impact on their own investigation that they're carrying out, but just so that we can help and support the families in that crucial early period. Often, as we all know, the NHS is stretched and victims need private rehab, and if we can get them out of the NHS system and free up beds and resources for other people, then we would like to do that to help them and their families, but also to help them gain access to funds to help with loss of earnings or the other associated trauma that comes with an accident that somebody's involved in. So it's important to work with the police, and I think that's my key message here, is that we're all on the same side, and we want to work with them to help them conduct their investigation as they need to, but also to help and support the families that alongside the investigation that they're carrying out.
Thank you. Rory.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for having me today. Police investigations are important for two reasons, twofold. One, in relation to obtaining justice for a victim when they've been seriously injured. And I should make it clear, I only act as a claimant series solicitor for victims who are generally cyclists or pedestrians, so the most vulnerable road users. And when I speak to a victim, they generally want to know what is happening in terms of the police investigation and whether justice is going to be served. Now, we're not really involved in that process because we are obviously civil solicitors who act in the personal injury claim. But it is quite heartbreaking when I go and speak to a victim at hospital or later on to explain to them that they need to be careful about putting their weight and confidence into the police, into doing a thorough investigation, when quite possibly that may not happen. And I hear quite frequently victims tell me it's okay, there's witnesses, they would have seen it and given the details to the police. And whilst I don't want to sound overly critical of the police, quite often information is not there and justice isn't served for that victim when they really want to see a prosecution for a driver who has put this person in this position where they have life-changing injuries. And the work that I do as a civil solicitor, as a personal injury lawyer, flows from the initial stage of police attending the scene, collecting information, and then that eventually makes its way to ourselves. That makes the victim's life so much more difficult in obtaining the much needed rehabilitation and plugging gaps in terms of earnings and being able to live from day to day, because some victims live hand by mouth. They're reliant on a monthly income to pay for their mortgage or rent or whatever it might be, and sometimes when collisions happen, that is immediately cut off because they don't have that income stream. It's hugely important for police to be able to understand that whilst a prosecution may be serving justice, it doesn't plug those gaps in financial aid for a victim, and that's where we come in. And if an investigation isn't conducted properly, that has a material impact on the victim, what really counts for them in the long-term future. Thank you.
Thank you. That's very clear. Nick, from RoadPeace sort of perspective.
And I think you're going to find a lot of consensus on this side of the table. So just to confirm that I agree with everything that the previous speakers have said. And also, Chair, thank you very much for starting this conversation by giving those statistics. And the only thing I'd add to that is that our sense is that the number of serious injuries is probably very significantly underreported. So I think the problem is even worse than we might imagine it to be. I suppose the two key points from a RoadPeace perspective that I wanted to share. Injuries and investigation into serious injury collisions are so important. They just represent access and the cornerstone to accessing justice, and without that there can be no justice. So that's why it's really important. And if collisions are not investigated, then there's very little prospect of any recognition that even a crime has been committed. And I think we discussed that a bit later on in the session in terms of recognising that road crime is a crime. And then finally, just to echo, without an investigation, there's no opportunity to learn, to prevent recurrences, and to progress towards achieving Vision Zero. So those are my comments.
Thank you. Sean, I'll bring you in at the end of this question. Amy.
I just wanted to mention how I believe TfL and the police appreciate the importance of collision investigation. It's already included in the Vision Zero action plan. They include actions to improve the training, but the focus was on the Roads Transport and Policing Command. And I think you'll hear today how collision investigation within the police is quite messy. It involves different units. But just say that the police and TfL are already quite aware of how important collision investigation is, and it's included in their action plan.
Thank you. That's really helpful, and yes, we will be picking up on more detail into investigations a bit later in these questions. Sean.
Thank you, Chair. Just a small question to Nick. Nick, you just said that you believe that there's underreporting of serious incidents. Is that correct? Did I understand that correctly?
Yes, that's what I said. Look, there are various definitions of serious and life-changing injuries, and I think there's a discussion about that. Without trying to sound inappropriate, clearly fatal collisions are always absolutely reported, but I think there's an area where there are serious life-changing injuries, and not all of those go to the police. Some might go through the NHS system, but I think there are a significant number of crashes where the victims do not report that. And I imagine colleagues might agree, but that's the sense of our members anyway.
Sean, you've got Amy wanting.
Amy, then Rory.
Okay. Yeah.
Hi, we've got a briefing out about this because DFT estimates the extent of underreporting into serious and slight injuries every year. They compare it with the National Travel Survey, where they ask the public if they've been injured in a collision. And DFT estimates it's about 3 times as many people are seriously injured in crashes than included in the Stats 19 and the police recorded stats. It won't be that bad in London, in urban areas, but it has been a good 15 years, if not longer, since TfL did research into underreporting in London. But yeah, DFT is quite clear that there is serious underreporting of serious injuries across the country.
Rory, did you?
Yeah, I was just going to say, possibly in London, collisions are better attended by police, borough police that is, mainly because it is an urban area and probably easier to access people who have been involved in a collision. But there are still collisions that don't get investigated by the police, or not in attendance by the police, i.e. the call-out time it takes a long time for a police to attend, and the emergency services get there first, i.e. an ambulance, deal with the victim and take them off to hospital. And therefore, that scene, the crime scene, if you like, has been lost. And then there are some times where there's no attendance by the police, and then victims have to self-report to the police retrospectively after it's happened. And I don't know why that happens, but it still does.
So there's no catch-all service. There's no body that says there's a serious accident's happened. Let's take a note of that.
Yeah,
it can fall into the police or the NHS, but they're never mated together, those figures.
Things can always be improved. I don't think there's an effective catch-all service. I think there's a lot of goodwill and there's a lot of communication, but I think the overriding message is that a number of serious collisions are not reported, and that's all the point I wanted to make to the members here, just to be aware that this problem is bigger than we even think it is.
And I think sometimes it's difficult for the police to understand if something is a serious collision, because often victims will have a head injury which is not visible and not obvious, and it may be a subtle brain injury. Whether that is reported as a serious injury or not is quite a difficult balancing exercise or judgment call for the police. I've had cases where they've attended, there are no physical scars or injuries that you can see, but the individual clearly has suffered a knock to the head, and the police, doing the best that they can because the victim is speaking, says, well, do you want to go home and do you want to report it tomorrow? Not knowing the subtleties of a head injury. So sometimes it's a bit nuanced.
Okay. Victoria?
I just think it might be helpful to explain how a serious injury is recorded, because when an officer attends the scene, and they don't always attend the scene, but when they attend the scene of a collision, they will record on their device based on what they think the most serious injury that person has sustained there and then. So that's before someone will have been treated or gone to hospital to have a full assessment of what injuries they have. So an injury will be recorded as either a slight, serious or a fatality based on the most serious injury the officer understands that person to have sustained. So as Dushal has said, people might have sustained head injuries, but the officer won't know that. So at the scene they might just say, well, it's grazes, and it gets recorded as a slight, or it will be very obvious and, okay, it's a broken neck, and that will be recorded as a very serious injury. So that's how it's done, so you can understand that there's lots of room for error within that system.
Okay. I'll throw back to the chair, and you add your comment, because we've got a lot to get through, and your comment will be relevant somewhere else, I'm sure. Chair, back to you.
Susan, you wanted...
Yes, it's only a quick one, and it's only a thought. But do you think some injuries are not reported because the pedestrian or the cyclist knew that they were the ones that... I've seen it happen myself. A cyclist, as an example, comes in, undercuts a car, and gets squeezed. When they've tried to squeeze through, I've seen it happen. That they're knocked off their bike. And they literally say sorry to the car driver because they know it was their fault. So I've seen that happen on quite a few occasions. So do we think that is why that is then not reported, because the victim, as it were, it actually knows it was their own fault?
My sense is that's a very fair comment, and I think that does happen. I suppose there's a blame culture, isn't there? And what in an ideal world we'd like to have is people sharing this information in an open way, but there are reasons why that doesn't happen. But yes, I agree with what you just said.
Yeah, I would say I also agree with what you say, Susan, but if someone is really seriously injured and they have done that and they've potentially caused that collision to occur, then the police should still attend and do an investigation.
Yeah, I'm not debating that. I'm just saying that could be why it's underreported.
Amy?
I just wanted to mention that that would apply to all road user modes, right, if they thought they were guilty. And there is no legal requirement. You don't have to report to the police. You have to exchange contact details. So it can be settled privately. But those are the ones that aren't the focus of today, because those are the ones that are not being investigated. Sorry.
Thank you. So my next question is about the guidance on investigation of serious collisions. There's the College of Policing has authorised professional practice guidance, which seems to be, is that the main guidance for investigating collisions? And yes, sort of what are your reflections on, so put me right if that's not the only guidance, and, you know, what are your reflections on that? Amy?
The College of Policing guidance is the national guidance, but that's really for fatals and life-threatening injuries. So that goes into the role of like the forensic collision investigator. That has really no relevance to the vast majority of serious injury investigations. There isn't any standard guidance for those investigations.
There's no standard guidance for serious injury investigations. And so who do you think should, I mean, that sounds like a gap. Is there an obvious source to fill that gap?
I mean, recently there's been such a focus on forensic collision investigation, because that's where they've had the international standards come in recent years, and that's where all the thinking, time, priority, money has gone to. And those are the much more technical, the reconstruction, the scientific. If you're looking at the serious injury investigations in terms of, like, you know, taking basic witness statements, I guess we'd look for the Mehta lead, considering they've got the largest number of serious injury investigations.
Victoria?
I think it'd just be helpful to explain just roughly what units we understand to be involved in terms of serious injury investigations, so that we can explain where the guidance is needed. So there's the Serious Collisions Investigation Unit. They have got forensic collision investigators and specialist officers. They investigate all of the fatalities every year in London, and about 100 of the serious injuries every year. The serious injuries now being investigated by the Serious Collisions Investigation Unit do not benefit from forensic collision investigators anymore, to do with a change with the forensic science regulator. And I think that's something that's important for the committee to ask the police when you have your next evidence session. The remaining kind of 3,759 serious injuries that happen in London every year, not investigated by the Serious Collisions Investigation Unit, we understand that those will have a borough police officer first attending the scene, and then that investigation tends to get passed on to the Met Traffic Prosecution Service, which is based at Marlow House, and police staff carry on that investigation from behind a desk. So it's not police officers doing it, it's police staff. And in terms of where we understand the gaps to be, we think there's gaps in terms of what the borough police are doing when they attend the scene, and what Marlow House are doing when they investigate from behind a desk, because there's no guidance in terms of what minimum standards need to be achieved, and we feel there should be guidance in terms of what police officers, what evidence they gather at the scene. So we think they should have to gather witness evidence, CCTV evidence, taking photographs at the scene, things like that, and then that should be something that they're held to account over. Thank you.
So you're saying that of the 3,859 serious collisions, 100 of them get the same investigation as the fatality collisions?
Not quite. They used to. So I had the same investigation as a fatality would have done. I had an amazing investigation by the Serious Collisions Investigation Unit, and I really can't praise them highly enough for what they did for me. Recently, there's been changes with the forensic science regulator, which means that forensic collision investigations are no longer involved in serious injuries. They're still involved in the fatalities, but not the serious injuries done by the Serious Collisions Investigation Unit. But still, the cases investigated by the Serious Collisions Investigation Unit will be more comprehensive than what's happening with Borough and Marlow House, I would say.
Thank you. Does break online? Jami, did you want to come in on this?
Yeah, thank you. I agree with most of what's been said, actually. I think how you categorise a serious injury is fundamental to this discussion, because there are different levels of injuries that will dictate different levels of investigation, which obviously has an impact on the people who are affected. I think if we lived in an ideal world, the level of investigations would have some parity across them. However, I just wonder how on earth you would resource that kind of standard level of investigation for all levels of serious injury. I agree that standards are a good idea because the skill level of officers attending collision scenes from Borough, for example, will be very different to the next Borough officer who attends. That's the nature of policing. When you are a Borough officer, you wear so many hats that you can't possibly be a specialist in all of those. So I think it's incredibly complex, and if we lived in an ideal world, standards would be applied and there would be enough police officers to investigate all of the serious injury collisions, but I just think it's unfortunate that that's not the case. I don't mean to sound defeatist about this, but I think that that's the reality of what we're looking at.
That's a depressing point, but I can see I can see the sort of realism. Rory, did you want to?
I just wanted to say, when a collision occurs, the police will attend the scene, normally Borough Police, and I should say there's really good Borough Police out there, determined Borough Police who want to get to the bottom of what's happened. Unfortunately, what we see is police attend the scene. It is their responsibility, if you like, to gather all the information that's available at that moment in time, and that's the critical period to determine how that prosecution, or whether it's not going to be prosecuted, goes. And there should be some sort of guidance or training for police officers in London to understand what they are looking for when they attend the scene. And I'm not convinced that one officer to the next knows exactly what they're looking for. And certain very basic information is lost at that initial stage, capturing witnesses who might be in the scene, looking to see if there's a traffic camera or a commercial property that might capture that for what happened. Basic things like photographs of the scene, positions of vehicles, positions of where people would have been travelling from, where did the victim end up when a collision has occurred, and even things that a lot of police officers have these days is body-worn cameras. They could turn their camera on straight away when they get to the scene and gather that information and give it to Marlow House, because that's where the determination of whether a prosecution is going to happen or not. All that information is passed over to Marlow House. Sometimes the investigations team at Marlow House, their hands are tied because the information isn't there, and all they can do is say, I'm sorry, there's not enough information here to prosecute. Sometimes there is, because there's been a really good initial search of the scene to see what's happened, get that information together. So, in short, there should be some sort of checklist or training that the police officer knows when they attend the scene, that they can look at when they attend the scene and say, is there witnesses in the scene? Do we have their details? Is there cameras? Is there body-worn footage that we can turn on? Can we take pictures?
I think, Umesh, you're saying we're coming into this in more detail.
Sure,
yes,
sure.
Just a little bit further on. So we'll. The next person to come in is Assemblymember Prince. I gather you wanted to come in at this point.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I wanted to talk about the more vulnerable road users. Given that some users of transport are proportionally more likely to be involved in a serious or fatal accident, should more attention be given to these accidents to identify learning? So I'm really angling towards two-wheel users, both powered two wheels and push bikes as well. Do we think that there should be a greater emphasis on those? Victoria, do you want to start?
Yes, absolutely. I think, the Mets and Transport for London are signed up to Vision Zero. I think if we want to reduce death and injury, then we've got to look at the types of collisions which are killing the most people and the most vulnerable people. Motorcyclists are incredibly vulnerable, and investigating those collisions is an incredibly important part of this. As I said at the beginning, I think because the contributory factors to collisions happening are recorded before an investigation has been completed, we don't know actually what the reality is in terms of why these collisions are happening. You know, I explained that speed was really underreported in those collisions. That there'll be other things as well in terms of mobile phone usage, things like that. If those crashes aren't investigated properly, we don't know what is causing those crashes. So yes.
I mean, that is included in the Vision Zero action plan. It's about criminal justice and also learning from the lessons. But I would agree with you that we've had more lessons come from investigations into HGV and bus collisions, and those aren't the ones posing the threat to motorcyclists or cyclists. It's more cars when you talk about serious injuries. And I know there's been a focus more on delivery riders, on power two-wheelers in there. But no, I think we'd agree, but that would involve, as Vicky pointed out, is really collecting much more information at the end of the investigation, because right now it's just reported at the start. It's almost like at triage stage. So, yeah, with you on that.
Dushal.
I just wanted to add to what Amy's just said, which is I think there is a focus on cyclists, and rightly so, but motorcycle users are also very vulnerable users on the road, as you say. And I think naturally we all will have seen people have a perception of delivery drivers on two wheels. That doesn't mean they're always in the wrong. That doesn't mean that their cases shouldn't be investigated. But unfortunately, as Victoria said at the very outset, once a contributing factor is put out there, unfortunately what you do see a lot of is not much more policing in terms of investigatory work. I'll just give one example. I had a case where a motorcycle delivery driver was in a bus lane which he was permitted to be in, and a car driver has taken him out, and he's got polytrauma, he's got multiple injuries. Unfortunately, the investigation was closed within 4 to 6 weeks with no action taken, no CCTV footage obtained, which we then obtained ourselves and found, which showed that he actually wasn't in the wrong at all. That's a very bad example. There are many good examples, but I think motorcycle users need to be also at the top of the agenda as well as cyclists.
If I could just follow on from what Dushal just mentioned, and it would probably be helpful to explain to you where these contributing factors come from. When the police attend the scene of a collision, I believe it's within 24 hours that they need to complete a basic police report, and that is gathering what they have at that stage and outline a conclusion as to how the collision occurred and what the contributing factors are. Very frequently, a victim hasn't even spoken to the police by this point, and they are just taking an account from probably the person who's caused this collision. And that sets the tone for the investigation ongoing. And of course, as humans, we're going to try and defend our position as to what's happened, unless you are honest and say, I hold my hands up. And quite frequently, motorists will be on the defensive and say, oh, they came out of nowhere, or I didn't see them, etc. And that is a problem that we see day to day in the work that we do, that police report should not be completed until they've at least spoken to the victim at some point later.
Can I come back to you? You touched on buses, because buses do contribute to a significant number of road deaths. Do you think there could be more done on that?
I don't think they do contribute to a significant number of road deaths. I think that's very low in London for deaths from buses. I think there has been a real focus on...
Last year.
Sorry?
I think they accounted for about 9% last year.
Okay. I think you've got cars accounting for over half. And I think there has been a real focus on the bus safety program. And I know there's a new one just out recently. I would just think that you're getting much better investigations into collisions involving a bus than you do a car. So you already have better information.
And I think part of that is that, particularly in London, bus companies are very proactive in assisting the police. So where you will have a case involving a bus and a pedestrian or a cyclist, they will usually voluntarily share their footage that they have from the bus itself with the police. So it kind of speeds the process up a lot in terms of the police investigation. There's more collaboration between bus companies and the police than there is with a normal car road user.
Do you find that the bus companies keep the footage? Because most buses have cameras, they tend to keep the footage.
Yeah, I, in my experience, they do, and they're not reluctant in sharing that footage. And it's usually, I have to say, quite comprehensive because, as we've all seen, you know, they're at the front, on the side, at the back, and internally as well. So it is usually very helpful.
I was just going to say, I don't know the ins and outs of the TfL contract with bus companies, but isn't there some sort of reporting system that they need to have in place for where collisions occur, so that they would generally save any footage where a collision has occurred anyway, and that would be available. And most buses these days have 15 odd cameras available, and that's the best evidence, some of the best evidence you're likely to get sometimes.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm now going to bring in Assemblymember Pidgeon, and we're moving on to look at specifically investigation in London.
Lovely, thank you. You've already sort of obviously touched on some of the areas I wanted to talk to you about, but can you talk through your experience of serious injury investigation in London? What's your understanding of how the Met investigates it, who's responsible, and you know, is it a priority? Should more be done in this area? Who would like to start? I'm going to start with Victoria.
Thank you. Yeah, so as I said, I had a very positive experience of the Serious Collisions Investigation Unit. They really did do a fantastic job. And I've just met a lot of people since then in my work who have not had as good an experience as me. And these are people who've still suffered very, very serious injuries. I think in terms of whether it's a priority, I don't think it is a priority for the police. I think when there's a fatality, it's a priority, but I think the 3,759 people who aren't getting their cases investigated by the SCIU, I don't think it is a priority for police. Jami mentioned that, you know, we can't expect to have really high standards of investigation for all of those serious injuries, and I'd agree with that. I don't think we should have forensic. It's not possible to have forensic collision investigators for 3,000 people. No one's arguing for that. But I think what should be possible is for the police to outline some minimum standards which are not resource intensive when they get to a scene, and that's just things like getting witness statements, taking some pictures, turning on the body-worn camera footage, as Rory said. We think these are kind of low-hanging fruit that should be possible to do. That would really, really improve people's access to justice, criminal justice and civil justice. In terms of it being a priority as well, I think the TfL and the Met have got an enforcement working group that's linked with Vision Zero, that there's campaigners involved and they're speaking to the community about their enforcement activity. We'd really like there to be something similar for collision investigation, and also if the Met could, in collaboration with TfL, have an action plan and strategy in terms of how they plan on improving collision investigation. That's also something that would be great to see that, you know, it was a priority for the Met. Thank you.
Okay, who would like to go next? Nick.
Could I just say, just in terms of those national guidelines and the standards, they are completely insufficient and inconsistent, and there's a sort of slight challenge here between what happens nationally and what happens locally or in London. I don't think those two are as joined up as they should be. By the way, you know, more resources needed and more specially trained officers, that's an absolute given. There is some work being done which you may be aware of in terms of post-crash support, which is being led by the DFT at the moment. But again, there's that whole confusion between where best practice sits and a lack of communication between local services and national services. So I would urge the committee to consider that and to try and make those more joined up. And I think London has got an incredibly potentially powerful role to play in setting best practice and setting examples. So I think that's something to really think about. And the other thing I would just say is that you know, RoadPeace are currently consulting with our members on this specific topic about the investigation and the quality of those of serious injuries in London. Typically, our members and victims feel let down by the lack of investigation or the quality of investigation, but we will share more detail of that with the committee in due course. And I just wanted to echo Victoria's points. I think a minimum standard is the absolute minimum that we should all work on, and it feels relatively achievable as a starting point.
I'm sure most members of the public would assume there was a minimum standard for this. Nick, can I just pick up with you, because I was reading that RoadPeace had stated previously that the National Authorised Professional Practice on Collision Investigation had been diluted, and you felt that the new Association of Chief Police Officers Road Death Investigation manual, which was replaced with this shorter 14-page College of Policing investigation road deaths, you know, isn't up to the job. And I'm just wondering if you've got anything more that you wanted to say on that, and have you actually seen an impact on the quality of police investigations as a result of this?
There's almost a sort of constant change in that area, and it comes down to the resource and the commitment and the priority that individual chief constables set around roads policing. The collision investigation wasn't a key responsibility of late, but it has now been brought back into their list of priorities. But again, it's just an example of a kind of an inconsistent message, and people having to fight to make sure that these areas sit appropriately in the list of priorities and tasks. So I'd like to give you a sort of slightly more considered response on that, but I'd need to get some facts. So can I reply sort of separately? I think it's a very valid point, and the bottom line is there is just massive inconsistency that keeps changing.
Which is worrying. Amy, you've got your hand up.
Yeah. Hi. That was me. I used to work for RoadPeace, and I did a review of road death investigation back in 2017. And the first road death investigation manual was done by ACPO in 2001. It was like, I can't remember, it was like 120 pages or even longer.
195.
Okay. And Police Scotland still has a really lengthy document. But then the College of Policing, I think it adopted maybe 2015, 2013, and it's much shorter. But also since 2017, there has been a real focus on fatal collision investigation. I mentioned around forensic, and then also College of Policing has done a lot more around road death investigation training. We finally had an HMIC FRS review in 2020, the first time in 20 years, and they looked at road death investigation. So it has gotten a focus, but again, that's all road deaths. Nobody is looking at serious injuries. It's almost like we need a different terminology from the really serious, the catastrophic ones, which should be treated as a fatal, and the serious injuries when you talk about the broken backs, broken legs, broken arms, that can have lifelong impacts, but they're never going to get a specialist investigation.
Thank you for that. Rory, Dushal, do you want to come in on this wider question?
I guess it's a general perception in society of what you deem a road collision to be, and it's quite easily written off as an accident when quite often it isn't an accident. And perhaps we should give greater priority to road collisions generally within the police investigations. You all know the facts better than me in London in terms of knife crime, but I had a little look online before I came here today to see how many people are affected by knife crime and attended hospital in comparison to how many people have been involved in a road collision. I can tell you that more people go to hospital in relation to road collisions than knife crime. So why are we not looking at those statistics, especially as they materially impact people?
And just whilst we've got the mic on, what do you see? I mean, your caseload is obviously very diverse. You see all sorts. Where are the gaps? What things would you recommend? We've heard some very clear thoughts from Victoria about how we could make sure things are adequately investigated.
Day to day, I see collisions. I speak to the Met Police pretty much every week, if you like. I have a constant dialogue with Marlow House. The problem lies generally with the individual who attends the scene.
Yeah.
And there are some really good police officers, and we should always realise the hard job that they do under time constraints, and they are going to one crime to another, to a road collision, etc. There needs to be a standard protocol put in place that police officers understand when they go to the scene to get this information. Following the initial attendance to the scene, there is obviously work that can be done post that, i.e. you can identify a camera, let's write to the shop owner to get that information straight away. It feels like there's a disconnect in that respect between the officers who attend and then what happens when it goes off to Marlow House. And sometimes that decision has already been made because they can't do anything about it. What I'm also finding, and this isn't everyone, but from time to time, of course you're going to have human element to an investigation, but there are victim-blaming statements from police officers within police reports that should just not exist. And that's really a personal kind of element as to who's investigating that collision. But there are instances where we've had to make complaints to the police about why this police officer has said that when there's absolutely no evidence to prove what they've just said. So that's basically my views on the matter, and it sounds quite selfish because I'm a personal injury solicitor, and of course I want the police to do the best investigation they can do, but there are simple things that can be done to help everyone.
It also would help these officers turning up at the scene.
Yeah.
We've got a lot of new officers in the front line knowing, here are my 5 things I've got to do. I mean, turning on the camera and getting a shot of everything, so it seems to be quite basic. Really.
Yeah, I guess an educational thing is the most, and training is the most important thing here, rather than anything else, because they understood. I suspect some police officers simply don't understand what information they should be looking to gather.
Yeah.
And it's not their fault, they're just not trained in that respect.
Thank you. Helpful. Dushal, anything to add?
Yes, just I don't think it's too much to ask to have that minimum standard, as Victoria and others have said. We don't expect forensics to be there on all collisions. It's just not feasible. Resources aren't there, and the borough officers often want to be able to do a good job, and there's clearly a massive gap here that they just don't have a minimum standard. So when you're asking about what should be on the checklist, you know, as Rory has said, witness details, CCTV, even seizing the bike or taking pictures of the vehicle, which to all of us here would seem pretty routine, isn't actually done, or photographs of the scene, making sure that if footage is obtained, that it is securely retained. Unfortunately, it does go missing quite a lot. You know, measurements, etc. I mean, this is just basic stuff that I think if they knew they had a checklist, they would automatically do.
Exactly. Thank you. That's really useful. And you would expect, you know, for any incident they turn up to, that they would just have that to hand, so they would know what to do. Before I bring you in, Victoria, can I just check, Jami, do you want to have any further comments on your experience of serious injury investigations and where there are gaps and improvements needed?
Thank you. I just wanted to come back to the point I think that Rory made earlier. I hope I've got that name correct. I think it is absolutely key to this discussion that this needs to be discussed at a policing level, at a local policing level within London, but more importantly, that has to be driven from a central government level. We are still waiting for the government's road safety framework to be announced. That will help set those priorities and set that direction at a more local level that will help with all of this to bring it together and set those standards, I think. We have to remember that 5 people are killed every day on UK roads. That was a point that Rory partly made earlier, is in comparison to crimes, as we understand traditional crimes to be knife crime, murders, manslaughters, there is not enough focus given on the number of people being killed on our roads in the UK every day, and that absolutely has to change. That is so central to all of this discussion. It would be wrong not to mention it this morning. I agree standard protocol is a positive piece of work that will contribute to this. And I know we're going to hear from the Metropolitan Police later on in this process, but I, on a personal level, know how challenging it is to want to do the very best job that I can when I'm investigating a collision. Even if it's a less serious collision, of course, as a police officer, I wanted to meet those minimum standards that were important to me. However, I know also how challenging it is to try and do that when you're standing at a busy road with lots going on, and you also have a radio dispatcher in your ear asking you to go to another incident around the corner where somebody's life is at risk. I think the resourcing is absolutely key to this discussion, and we can't overlook that. So that's all I wanted to say at this time.
Lovely, thank you. And Victoria, you just wanted to come in as well.
Yes, I just wanted to make a very quick point that London's a bit unique in that it's borough officers attending the scene and then the follow-up investigation at Marlow House. Across the country, from my understanding, it's mostly that it's roads policing officers that will attend the scene and then manage the investigation to its completion. So it's not like in London where it's police staff managing the investigation.
Is there a difference then in terms of outcomes as a result, that sort of specialist team versus borough teams?
I think I'll ask if Rory and Dushal could come in here, because they're the ones that are seeing the collision investigation reports.
The outcome basically comes from what evidence has been obtained at the scene. That dictates it. I've had quite frequently in the last couple of months people from... I understand not all of the officers at Marlow House are police officers, but they have a standard protocol apparently now that they've been told, driven by the CPS, that unless there is CCTV or independent witness or evidence of a collision taking place, they will not prosecute the person who's caused the collision. That simply cannot stand. That simply cannot be acceptable. When you have a vehicle pulling in or out of a junction across a cycle lane, knocking a cyclist off their bike, of course there's going to be places where there isn't CCTV or independent witness evidence, but the mechanics of how a collision occurs should be enough for a prosecution. And whilst I'm not suggesting there should be presumed responsibility of a driver, there is the hierarchy of vulnerability put in place only last year when the revisions to the Highway Code took place. And that needs to be borne in mind when investigators look at these collisions or police look at these collisions. And certainly a prosecution should be at least put forward and see where that gets you, because quite frankly there is a large number of cases where the police do not even entertain a prosecution for the fear of failure of whatever happening. And quite frankly, there are a lot of drivers that will say, fair cop, yeah, we actually caused this, we accept the responsibility for it, but they don't even get that opportunity because there is that protocol in place where they just won't prosecute.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to start with our online guest for this first question. How do you think the Met compares to other police services in investigations with serious injury collisions?
That is a very difficult question.
Yes.
And I think it would need to start with a huge amount of evidence gathering to give you an informed answer to that. At the beginning of this discussion this morning, I think Victoria touched upon the difference in departments and processes that are involved across the country. Some police forces have serious collision units, some have major collision inquiry teams, some have roads policing units that do all of the investigations of fatals and serious collisions. I can't give you an informed answer, and I'm not really prepared to do that because I don't think it would be fair without having any evidence behind it. I think it's an incredibly complex picture. So sorry if that sounds like
I see where you're coming from because obviously it needs to put you have to say the Meta good or bad. Let me ask you a different question, a slightly different question. When you look at all the different ways teams are built that look at these investigations, have you seen things that you consider best practice? I'll come to other members of the panel, but again to our online guests, have you seen certain ways or certain teams that are built in a particular way that tend to give a slightly better result?
I don't think I have, to be honest. I think there are pockets of good practice across the country where they are that individual force gives collision investigation a higher priority. Now, whether that is a decision that they've taken on their own to do that, or whether that is very importantly something that's set by their police and crime commissioner. Road safety strategies are patchy within police and crime commissioners' strategies, that the police and crime plans that are set. So I can see pockets of best practice that have, most importantly, I think for me, the number of resources that they need to do a good job, and for me that dictates the difference between good quality and a sort of a good sweep of investigations for all serious injuries, and not. I think the resourcing is probably the biggest key difference I see across the country, and we work with all police forces across the country, so I would say that was probably the most key point out of all of that.
Okay, thank you. Amy, I'm going to come to you. Do you sometimes see structures within a police team that have a better chance of giving a good result? Because we've had a lot of conversation this morning about, a basic level, whatever, but are there some teams that have been able to capture that within in their own setup?
Let me provide some background context. Vicky's mentioned her personal experience, but Vicky and I used to work for RoadPeace, and in 2019, that's when I left, but we had been working on a Trust for London funded project of London traffic justice that included baseline reviews of traffic law enforcement, collision investigation, and victims' rights. So we had come up with a set of recommendations. The police and TfL had already fed back on the report, and Vicky took that forward. And they had come up. The report was never published because they were going to implement some of the recommendations with improved training. Then COVID hit, and I think things have been dropped. And for the past over a year, Vicky and I have been trying to work with TfL to pick this back up, and they were developing a quality assurance workshop. But it's such a split between whether it's Roads Transport Policing Command or borough officers or Marlow House. it's real mess, would say. It's a much fragmented approach. And then we don't see that outside London. They don't have a civilian base investigating during the follow-up of the vast majority of serious injury collisions. I also remember when I used to work at RoadPeace, the police services saying how important it was to have a dedicated evidential review officer. Of course you would have that with fatals, but most police services didn't have that with injury investigations. It would be back to just peer review, your mate next to you checking your work, and you check his work next week. But if you had a dedicated officer, some police told us that really improved the quality of their injury investigations. That's one. But also, as just say, there's a real issue around transparency. It's something we've been campaigning on for so many years because the outcomes aren't reported. I'm not trying to find out about individual investigations, but I think it should be possible to know how often after a pedestrian serious injury is there a prosecution? How does that vary, whether it's a nighttime pedestrian collision or daytime? And then that's how you'd want to compare those kind of outcomes between police to see if anybody had a higher rate of convictions. And also, I guess the key thing is around no further action. What are the reasons? We've pushed for that. This goes back years. TfL had done a review of seriously injured cyclist collisions, I believe in 2014, in the City of London, looking at no further actions to see, was it because there wasn't enough evidence collected at the scene, or was it the fault of the victim? That never got published. But I think that'd be a real, very revealing to look at the reasons for no further action, which is the same as any kind of crime investigation, right? You may be losing a lot down to lack of victim engagement. We don't know how often that is down to victims not completing the questionnaire that's sent to them, which we think is quite poor and could really do with being updated. You know, they don't even have a proper full sentence, full space to write down their injuries.
Okay.
It's the same form that goes to drivers, witnesses, and anyone injured, no matter the severity of your injury. It can't be right.
Maybe that can appear in our recommendations, Chair. Just Rory.
I was just going to say your best comparison would be to look at another city rather than another county, because for transparency, my job, I only act for mainly cyclists by virtue of their British Cycling membership. So we are the principal solicitors for British Cycling. So I see collisions all over the country. Okay, a large majority of my collisions happen in London, and therefore geographically, and to think of the size of of England and Wales, you are going to have a collision here, there, Wiltshire, whatever county it might be, and there will be road policing generally that will attend those collisions because they don't happen as much as they do in London. So if you're trying to compare where London stands with other counties or potentially other cities, your best comparison is to look at other cities rather than in a comparable size.
And that makes perfect sense. Just to draw down to it, and are you suggesting, or is it a possibility because in a county situation it's attended by road policing, you potentially get a different outcome?
We don't have the evidence, but the impression I have, and I'm sure Rory has the same, is that in our experience, you know, if you go to Surrey, you get a better experience than you do in the Met because you've got one unit who are solely responsible for the entire investigation. Right. What we have in London, unfortunately, and it's due to the size, of course, and issues like that, you've got the borough police who are attending, then you've got Marlow House doing some of the investigation, and it's not a joined-up approach. In my experience, there is much more collaboration with other counties and other cities in terms of the police investigation, sharing information with us, but also sharing information with the victims and their families than there is in London, just because I imagine there is just too many cooks, frankly. You've got one set on the scene, the borough officers, and then you've got Marlow House and family liaison officers, etc. So there's no conjoined approach there.
Yeah, London's scale is often the challenge in many arenas. Let's move on to this question of resource. Now, it's quite obvious to anybody you could always have more. You know, we could always have more. Sometimes it's infuriating sitting on this side of the table saying the government need to give more. Of course, they could give more to almost everything. But where would you feel that any extra resource would be most effective? I'm going to start with Amy, and then I'll come to Nick, and then anybody else can come in after that. But if you were to give some more resource, where do you think it'd be most effective to place that resource?
With the focus on serious injury collisions, I think it'd have to go into training so that all the borough officers across the city would be better equipped when they attend the scene.
Okay, that's a very clear. That sounds like a clear recommendation, Chair. That's a very clear answer, Nick.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think more resources needed, and more specifically trained officers, is very clear. The other area that I would suggest needs to be considerably improved is the whole area around communication with victims. I think that they don't feel sometimes that they're informed enough as to how any investigation is progressing, whether charging decisions changed, and the whole access to information. And this disclosure point keeps coming up as well when we speak to legal organisations. And we sort of keep flipping between London issues and national issues, but some forces across the country are very poor at providing information to legal partners, and that's the point we discussed earlier. It's so important that these things are dealt with as quickly as possible for all sorts of reasons. So disclosure is another key area which needs to be improved.
Thank you. Just to wrap up, I'm going to come to you, Victoria. When you had your accident, did you feel like you were being looked after by a particular police officer? So I do a lot around knife crime and violence, and I've had a number of young people I've worked with be unfortunately stabbed to death, and the difference has been the liaison officer. So I have one parent who was never ever going to be happy because of her relationship with the liaison. So is there a liaison officer, and are they any good? Do they have a way of operating?
Yes, family liaison officers do exist. I think they're just for fatalities.
That's my point. I mean, in serious injuries, that's what I'm talking about here, as opposed to a fatality.
I didn't have a family liaison officer.
Right.
But I did have an amazing senior investigating officer. And they just did a fantastic job in terms of keeping me informed of what was happening and making sure I understood the whole process. And even though, in terms of the court outcome, he pled guilty to careless driving, the driver, and just got 6 points off his licence and a fine. I felt very satisfied with that whole process because I knew the police had done a fantastic job investigating it, and I just felt like they were really on my side. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people who suffer very serious injuries don't have that.
Yes.
And often it's more frustration around not being kept informed and not feeling like the police are investigating it more than the justice outcome. Like it's almost like what people aren't after. I think in most cases, vengeance and wanting someone to go to prison for a long time, I imagine. It's more about feeling like what's happened to you has been taken seriously.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Rory?
Absolutely what Victoria said. The most keeping a victim updated as to what is going on is hugely important for them. Sometimes there won't be a prosecution, and victims will accept that if a relatively good investigation has been conducted. But what I see day to day is sometimes victims are taken off to hospital. They don't even have a reference number. They don't have a point of contact. They don't know what's going on with their investigation. Quite frequently, I have to tell clients to call 101 and track down the reference number, to track down the police officer, for them to be able to give a statement to the police. That should never happen. As soon as the collision happens, badge number, police officer, point of contact, reference number, straight to the victim, so that when they are capable of doing so, they can speak to the police. And quite frequently, when the police come to a conclusion, they will not contact the victim other than sending them a letter saying, not enough evidence, sorry. There needs to be a human element for a phone call to say to that victim, explain to them exactly why, unfortunately, a prosecution couldn't have been brought in this circumstance.
Sure.
Just to echo the point that Nick made about communication with the families and what Rory was just saying, one of the issues that I face, particularly in London, because we are a diverse community, and I'm not sure, on a resourcing level how you deal with this, but where you have a victim where English is not their first language, in my experience, there is little or no communication with them. And that can't be right. I appreciate we can't have police officers at the scene or backroom staff who speak all languages, but there needs to be an ability to communicate with them as to what is going on, because what I generally find, and I'm sure Rory does as well, we end up having to be the people in between, and of course that's not helpful because the police are getting badgered by us, but also the family want to hear directly from the police, and often, you know, where English is not somebody's first language, it is a real issue trying to get information as to what is going on and where, you know, what investigations they're undertaking. So on a resourcing level, I think that needs to be looked at as well.
Thank you for that, because in my experience dealing with the police and advocating for people, that relationship, as Victoria said, is often more important than the outcome. And I think, Chair, that needs to be reflected in our recommendations. Anyway, back to you, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm now going to bring in Assemblymember Desai, although we have slightly touched on the area of questioning, but Assemblymember Desai, do you want to still go ahead?
Yes, you're right, Chair. I think to some extent, if not a large extent, you already touched upon the question that I was going to ask. But can I just say that I welcome what you said, Dushal, right at the very beginning, and I quote, "We are all on the same side. We need to work with the police." I think it's a good starting point. So my formal question is this. In your experience, are the Met officers adequately trained in serious injury investigations? Why? Obviously, I'm not going to ask you to repeat what you already said, but if there's anything else to add or expand upon. Victoria?
Yeah, I think what we said earlier, sorry that we cut into your questions. I think I'm not exactly sure in terms of what training Marlow House receive or exactly what training borough officers receive, but I think there needs to be more, particularly if the police agree to having a minimum standards that officers have to do when they go to a scene. I think there needs to be some training around that, for sure.
I was going to say, we just lost the head of the Roads Transport and Policing Command unit, but we had gotten him to agree to consider sitting down and meeting with the solicitors so they could review cases and see why there hadn't been prosecutions, or try and come to better understanding of how the police like define or investigate careless driving or speeding, because these are quite difficult issues. We'll have to start over with that new one. But no, I don't think the training, we know that TfL and Met Police have told us that they have been working on improving the training, and they've even got like 10 top tips for the key problems, but they haven't shared the information with us exactly what covers.
If I could just add, I mean, yes, the training is insufficient. It's poor, not just with the Met, but across the country. And I suppose the other thing from a RoadPeace perspective, one of the things that we're really keen to do and can work very effectively, we try and make opportunities for our members to talk with police officers and to share their experience as well. And as you've done today, I think listening to that and learning is incredibly powerful and important. And there are some very key messages that can be delivered by that. So we would urge that the victims' voices listened to more and followed.
Rory and Dushal, and then, yeah.
I'm actively involved with the all-party parliamentary cycling and walking group, and Victoria and myself recently gave evidence in a road justice review, and 10 key recommendations came out of that review, and it was published, and you can find it online. And one of those recommendations was a National Road Policing Commissioner, and I certainly think there could be a place for that, where that commissioner can go around police forces and train police officers in what to do in road collisions.
I think I'll just echo what everyone else has said. Clearly more training needs to be done, but just to pick up on one of the points that Nick made, which was around national guidance on disclosure. That's something that we've been working with the police for some time over, and Nick was involved as well. And there just is not a consistent approach on disclosure, notwithstanding the fact that there is a national guidance on what should and should not be disclosed by the police. There's no joined up approach with that, so you can often write to a police officer and say, by the way, are you aware of this national guidance? You need to provide us with that. And they say, oh, sorry, didn't know about that, here you go. Clearly there's a communication issue within the police, but there needs to be more of a joined up approach on things like disclosure as well as training at the scene.
Joined up approach. And finally, Amy, if I can bring you in.
Jami.
That's Jami, sorry.
Thank you. I think an interesting model for consideration, and it touches on a previous point as well in relation to training, is the police forces that have the major collision inquiry team or serious collision investigation unit model that largely consists of detectives that are trained to a certain PIP level. I think that has potential to improve the standards of investigation. I can't comment upon whether the standards of investigation of those units is higher than otherwise. I don't have any evidence to support that, but I think that's certainly a good place to start with those standards. You talked about communication earlier, and I think that is really key to victims feeling heard. There are some examples of good practice across the country where traffic prosecution units have made a commitment to write to people who've been seriously injured in collisions to update them about investigations, and that simply makes those victims feel that they are important and feel that they are heard, and that in turn makes them feel supported. There are also pockets of good practice around the deployment of family liaison officers to serious collisions. That doesn't happen in all parts of the country, but it does happen in some where there are enough family liaison officers to support that model. So I think that has some potential to move forward with. Sorry, I'm going backwards because I didn't have the opportunity to comment upon an earlier point that was made in terms of prosecutions. We did a little bit of data gathering within Break last year around the percentage of prosecutions that result from a fatal collision in comparison to the percentage of prosecutions that result from a serious injury collision. It was in a certain part of the country where the data was available and was sort of made sense to gather and come to a conclusion. Around about 20% of fatal collisions in that area resulted in a successful crime number being generated, a successful crime being recorded, now not necessarily resulting in a prosecution, but it gave it that recognition that that victim needed, that they were being heard, and that their case, I suppose, was being taken seriously in terms of that crime threshold. In comparison to serious injury collisions, that number was less than 5%. So the evidence that we saw in that part of the country was that far, far less serious injury collisions were resulting in a crime being associated with them. That's in terms of Home Office recording rules. So that I think that offers some potential to look at an evidence-led solution as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, and that's those numbers are really shocking. Assembly Member Devenish.
Thank you, Chair. Now, many of these questions I think have been answered in part, so please be succinct and do add new things rather than say what you've already said, please. First question for all the panel, I'll start on that end if I could. Has transparency and accountability in collision investigation improved in London? And if so, why? You may actually be saying no, I fear.
No, there has been a slight improvement with the Vision Zero enforcement dashboard. That will tell you when there's been arrests for causing death by driving or causing serious injury. But there's so much more that could be done. And the police tell us that when Connect comes in, that's when they will be able to publish the outcomes of the investigations. And we had expected much more improvement by now, because that was one of the actions in the Vision Zero action plan. So I'd say there has been some improvement, but we expected so much more by now.
Thank you, Victoria.
I think there's a couple of things that could be done to help transparency and accountability. The first thing is level of satisfaction surveys should be sent to victims of collisions. That could just be a very short survey to understand victims' impressions of the quality of the investigation and how they were kept informed. And that would be so useful, because then, in a few years' time, we'd be able to answer this question much better, to say, okay, are victims being more satisfied with how their collisions are being investigated? I think it would provide really helpful data and would give a really good understanding of what's happening at the moment for victims. And then the second point is around investigation outcomes being reported and reasons for no further action, which we've touched on before, so I won't go into more detail now.
Thank you. Nick?
I would echo Amy's comments. I think there is a better inclination towards transparency, but it still needs to be drastically improved. And also, just to briefly reiterate, we are consulting with our London members to report back on their detailed thoughts on these things at the moment. But there's a sense that things are heading in a better direction.
Thank you. Rory?
I'm conscious that the police have a duty under data protection, so they're obviously minded not to give much away at any time or prejudice their own investigation into a possible criminal prosecution. I think it's got better, and I don't know whether that's because I continue to badger Marlow House weekly, and they know that I am actually a regulated solicitor and they can give me certain information. But there seems to be a lack of understanding about what they can and can't disclose at certain periods of time, and police officers will hang their hook, if you like, on data protection and won't give anything until the end of the investigation, which could be 6, 12 if a prosecution. Recently there has been, and I haven't seen it, but there is guidance now when a prosecution is going to take place. They can now disclose the police report and witness statements, because ultimately the motorist who's caused the collision is going to see that anyway, so it doesn't prejudice the investigation. I think there needs to be a better understanding as to what can be disclosed at certain periods of time by the police, and quite frequently the guidance online by the CPS and National Policing. I have to send that to Marlow House to say, your own guidance tells you that you can disclose documentation. But I think it's got better, and the understanding of that has got better in the last couple of years.
Thank you. Dushal?
Nothing further to add.
Brilliant. Excellent answer. Amy?
Jami,
sorry.
No, I don't have anything further to add. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And my next question, similarly again, how well do you believe the Met communicates in serious injury collision investigation work to victims and their families? It's stressed the latter point, including on the investigation process, the timeline and the charging decisions, and what does it do well, and where are improvements needed? And I'll start online. Jami?
Yeah, thank you. I don't have anything to add in relation to that question.
Thank you. Dushal?
It's difficult to say what further steps could be taken to make it better. In my experience, unfortunately, there isn't much liaising between the police and families in terms of timelines and where they are, and often it's a case of families chasing. You said it was with the CPS for a charging decision, what next, and not getting that information back. Now that will come back to resourcing. They've got a lot to do, but perhaps it would be helpful to have a dedicated person, perhaps in Marlow House, who can report back to families once the police investigation is done, because often the frustration lies with the length of time it takes between an investigation being completed and a CPS decision being undertaken or being made. I often find that's a frustration from families.
Thank you. So a family liaison officer, Chair, we could put that in our recommendations, I'm sure. Rory?
I've already spoken about what police don't do sometimes in terms of communication at the outset. Borough police actually sometimes are really good with victims in terms of when they're still investigating and gathering evidence. And I've seen quite frequently chains of emails between police officer and the victim explaining what they're doing, and that's really good and it's helpful. What happens though, they collect all the information and give it to Marlow House, and then it's like barriers up. You can't get anything out of them, and that line of communication is cut off, unfortunately, because it's gone elsewhere, and that officer who is investigating is no longer in charge of that. It's now gone to Marlow House, unfortunately. But I should say there are really good borough officers who do communicate with victims, which is really helpful for them.
Thank you. Nick?
Yeah, there are some exceptional individuals and there are some poor individuals. I think the lack of an FLO or a single point of contact is a really key concern, and I think that would be a very effective way forward. And I think the final thing to say just on this point is that I'm not sure that best practice is understood and shared across the wider group, and I think that would be a very useful thing just to capture that and describe it.
Thank you. Victoria?
I think one thing that would really help is if there was a guide or an information leaflet produced that was shared with seriously injured victims as to what they can expect from the police investigation process. I think that would really help to almost hold the police to account, but also mean that victims know that they should have a point of contact and they should be able to find out if the police have gone to get the CCTV evidence and that kind of thing. So I think that was quite an easy, practical thing that would really help on that front in terms of the communication.
Thank you. And Amy?
I just wanted to mention around communication. I mean, Rory mentioned the example where a family wasn't given contact details. Then the family, if they have to get that from the police, they have to pay for it. They have to pay for a search. They have a legal right to the vehicle registration number. Again, they have to pay for that. They'll have to pay for every witness statement, every collision investigation report. They're supposed to be able to claim that back in a civil claim, but there will be a time lag. So when we talk about resourcing, just remember how much money is coming from crash victims. The other thing I just wanted to mention, our previous question, I think all of us talked about transparency. We didn't get into accountability. And I'm not sure how the police are able to prove that they do thorough investigations, something we're always asking. It's not going to be offenses brought to justice because not all crashes involve criminal culpability. You know, when we looked at this with fatal crashes before, it was like case file quality, it was meeting deadlines, it was feedback from solicitors, coroners, or families. But I think it'd be a really useful thing to do is for the police to tell us how they can prove they're doing thorough investigations into serious injury collisions and give the families, victims, and public confidence in them.
Thank you. And my final question, again, there'll be some repetition, so please keep your answers concise. In your experience, how easy is it to acquire information from the Met when it is necessary for victims' access to civil compensation following a collision, and how could this be improved? And I'll start with Amy.
And I'll pass it straight to the solicitors who have much more experience than that.
Okay, Victoria, do you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I think Rory and Dushal are the ones to answer.
Nick, you okay?
Only that on our helpline, our members raised these issues as a concern, but it's fine.
Right, over to the lawyers.
In short, exceptionally difficult to get the information. I was looking through a case of mine before we came here today, and just to get the VRN number, my client or we had to make an application, pay £34, took 3 to 4 weeks. I mean, that is basic information that we, but the family, are entitled to. Then you get, well, if you want the next piece of evidence, the police report, here's another £100. Then what we get, and I'm sure Rory will say the same, is we get drip-fed what they've got, rather than just telling us at the outset, this is what we've got, this is what you can obtain, this is how much you need to pay. They must be absolutely infuriated with the number of letters and calls that they get from solicitors. Frankly, we are taking up more of their time than needs to be the case. If there was just a conjoined approach, as I said earlier, we are all on the same side, just to say, this is what we have, Dushal, this is what I can give to you at this stage, and this is what you need to pay to get it, it would be a lot easier. But there is a difference in terms of who you get. We've spoken earlier about some borough police or Marlow House police officers being very forthcoming and very good. Equally, you will have others who don't actually know what they can and can't provide. And unfortunately, it's hit and miss for us.
You happy with that, Rory?
Just say that Section 170 of the Road Traffic Act says that when you're involved in a collision, you should exchange details. A victim is not going to do that when they're lying on the floor. The police are there to gather that information to the police, and quite often, when they get that information, they then hide behind the Data Protection Act to say, actually, we can't give you that information until you've instructed a solicitor. Absolutely ludicrous. We come in at the outset because we can materially help victims straight away by speaking to the insurance company of the motorist and try and get a rehabilitation package put in place, because I can tell you the NHS will be very quick to kick you out of hospital and send you back home because they need that bed space. Who is going to pay for all the needs that this person needs when they cannot get out of bed, cannot get upstairs? It is going to have to, we have to speak to insurers straight away, and we need that information. The victim needs that information more than I do, and they should be given that straight away at the bedside, which is why what Amy said, if there is a short booklet given to the victim or given to paramedics, that it is passed on to the hospital, which simply says, this is what's going to happen, here is the police officer in charge of attending the scene, here is a reference number, and quite possibly, and I err on the side of caution, the vehicle registration number. You're going to be very difficult to track who that person is who is driving that vehicle, but as long as you have the vehicle registration number, an ask mid-search can be made to find out who the insurer is, if there is insurance, obviously. But that will start the ball rolling instantaneously.
Thank you. Jami, do you have anything you wanted to add?
No, in relation to that point, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. That was very, very brisk, Assemblymember Devonish, and very efficient. Assemblymember Cooper.
Thanks. We're going to move on to some questions about victim support, but we have kind of been touching on it every now and again. So this is going to throw this open to all of you and then see who'd like to come in first, and obviously Jami as well, who's out there somewhere. And it's just really about the level of support in London that's in place at the moment in London for victims of serious injury collisions and their families. Do you think that this level of support has changed over recent years? Any improvement or any getting worse? I can see Rory is making a face. I'm going to pick on you then.
I should try and put my poker face on a bit better. I don't think it's changed much, if I'm perfectly honest.
You don't think it's changed much?
No, unfortunately.
Do you think it's not got worse then, but you wouldn't say there's been any improvement?
I don't think it's got worse. In my experience, I've acted in this industry. I qualified 9 years ago, and I've acted in this industry for 15 years, and I don't think it's got much better. If you like, it's about the same as far as I'm concerned.
Right. So at the moment we're marking the homework, some done, but much to do.
Sure.
Yeah. Would you agree with that as well, Dushal?
I would say that it's got a little worse. I think that in my experience, compared to when I started doing this work, the interaction between the police and families has got poorer. I think many police officers hid behind, during COVID, it was particularly bad. I think Victoria mentioned earlier, it may have been Victoria or Amy, how when there's not a prosecution, often families will just get a letter. Frankly, that is not acceptable. And in my experience, that didn't used to happen before. There'd at least be a courtesy call. and often the families will just say, Dushal, here's the letter, got no idea why, or what they've done. So in my experience, I don't think it's got any better, and in fact I think communication has deteriorated.
I can see that Rory wants to come back in on that now.
I don't disagree with what he has to say, but in my own personal opinion, I do this work because my background was racing bicycles for a long time, and I've been knocked off my bike quite a few times. And I have historically, thinking back in 2015, I got knocked off my bike by a bus driver who wasn't paying attention and drove into the back of me. And I got 2 letters on the same day from the police. One was, we're investigating this collision. One, we're closing this investigation. And because I work in this industry, I wrote to them and said, did you get the footage from the bus company? No. I got the footage, gave it back to them, prosecution. Now, I've been knocked off my bike more recently, and the communication has been better in that respect, and a proper investigation, if you like, has been undertaken. But the communication in that respect was better, that maybe because I am a solicitor, that people knew to talk to me a bit more, and I knew to ask the questions.
So I mean, I don't. I'm actually a substitute, as you heard at the beginning, for a colleague who can't be here today. So I don't normally sit on this committee. So I messaged a couple of people to say that this is what we were discussing this morning, because I know it's of significant interest to them. And one of them herself had a particular accident. And I sort of described the subject as being, the police response to serious injury collisions. Got a sort of a fairly excitable message back saying, well, there is no response to serious injury collisions by the police. I was left at the roadside in a coma and they didn't bother to do anything, and it's taken me a long time to get over my head injury. Now, that is just somebody who I happen to know, who happened to reply to me. But I can see an awful lot of nodding heads on the panel now to that point that was just made very starkly to me about the topic for today. And so I would now pose the question to the rest of you, has there been any improvement since my friend had that horrible experience, or would you say there's not really been any improvement? I'm going to bring in Nick because he's keen.
Sorry, itching to go. Well, I just canvassed our helpline staff on this, and the response I got was pretty much the same as you. The answer I've got is there has not been support for serious injuries. So I suppose the simple, whatever there is
no, it's not just the person either. I was also asking about for people's families as well. So,
and I think that's another really important point, because there is this ripple effect. So sure. The individual is affected, families, but also friends and colleagues. So the impact of serious collisions is enormous, and we don't always think about it. But I don't quite know how to answer this. I just think the support is very poor and drastically needs to be improved.
Do either of you want to add to that, or do you feel they've covered that one off?
I'd just say, but just in terms of supporting families and victims, I mean, TfL and MOPAC have just agreed a support services package. So fatal bereaved families will be getting assistance, and those are the most serious life-changing injuries. It amounts to only 3% of those seriously injured in London, so it's a tiny number, and they've said they're even worried about it continuing. But those support services are going to be provided by Break and RoadPeace, so they'll know better about it. But I'm just saying, in terms of emotional support for the very smallest amount of people, it should be better.
So this is my next question, in fact, is to Break and to RoadPeace, so to you, Nick, and also Jami. How will the pilot victim support service, which has just been announced in September, improve support for victims of the most serious road traffic collisions in London?
Could I just backtrack a moment, because I was trying to make myself known, but I didn't quite achieve that in answering the first point, but I think it does lead into this very important part of the discussion. When we talk about support for road victims, I think we have to be really clear about what we mean by that. The pathway into support absolutely begins with the police, so firstly by their attendance at the scene, and then their referral into support services. But even where family liaison officers are deployed to fatal and very serious collisions, their role as a family liaison officer absolutely has to be an investigative one. That is what is directed by the College of Policing. So they are not deployed to a family to provide practical and emotional support. Their role is purely investigative, and that is for many, many important reasons. So I think we have to really make a distinction around what we mean by support, because it's quite a sort of general word to use that can have many sort of meanings. The new pilot project that Brake and RoadPeace have been working on, I can tell you that it's taken many, many months to this point. It went live as of the 13th of November, which is a week past Monday. That means that as a standard, as a rule rather than by exception, which was what was happening prior to the start of that pilot, all bereaved and very seriously injured road victims in London that are dealt with by the Serious Collision Investigation Unit should have a referral made to them for support, or the opportunity of referral made for support. So road victims in those circumstances in London will, by rule rather than exception, have a conversation with a police officer that gives them that pathway into support, and that's where Brake and RoadPeace will be working together. Now, the complexity around those families that only go through the serious collision investigation is wrapped around funding. So we would, Brake and RoadPeace, I'm sure, would love to provide that support offer to everybody who is seriously injured in London, but the funding that we provided hasn't been sufficient to do that. So it can only be, I suppose, ring fence to the fatal and most serious injury collisions. But that is a real step change for the Metropolitan Police and what's going to happen in London. That means that pathway is much more secure and will happen much more often than it did before. And I think that starts with the understanding of the police officers that simply knowing what to do to make that referral into a specialist support service is there now, whereas before it wasn't.
Thanks, Jami. Nick, do you want to build on that?
Well, I think, look, I mean, just to add, we obviously welcome the provision of the support service and the fact that the seriously injured are involved. I think everyone involved in the project acknowledges it doesn't go far enough. It's a start. It needs to be improved, and we hope that will happen. And there's a fine line here because, you know, we're excited about the benefit and the services that we can deliver, but we would like to do more and we need to do more.
Okay, well, that was going to be my next question, but I think you've both answered it. Does it go far enough? No. What more is needed? And I think actually Jami just set out what would be helpful there, so I'm not going to ask that because that's a bit redundant. Thanks very much all for your answers. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. So I'm now going to bring in Assemblymember Hall.
Thank you. In your experience, to what extent has the London Victims Commissioner supported victims of road collisions in London, and what impact do you believe this is having on the experience of victims? I don't know who wants to start. Victoria? Amy?
Well, when Vicky and I worked at RoadPeace, we were on the Victims Reference Group, and I'd say the London Victims Commissioner worked well with us. She included us. Vicky spoke at victims' conferences or so, so it wasn't a priority, I'd say, for her, but we were at least included in a way that I would say wasn't always true across the country. But that was a few years ago, so.
I think there was also, I can't remember what it was called, but there was she did a review of different crimes in London. Must have been in 2018 or 2019, or a survey of victims, and road crash victims were included in that. So that's positive.
Anything more recent than 5 years ago, gentlemen?
I think what I'd add to this, and we are having conversations with the London Victim Commissioner to sort of mean that we can try and work together more collaboratively. The challenge I have is that whenever I attend meetings, without in any way trying to sound inappropriate or glib, there are so many victims, charities there, and organisations represented, and the problem that RoadPeace have is that road crime is not treated like a road crime, and we are not necessarily perceived as being real victims. I mean, they are victims, but not of a crime. So that's the piece of work that we're trying to do to work more effectively and have road crime treated like a real crime, and then for the Victims Commissioner to support us more in that process.
What percentage do you think of accidents or crimes are accidents? As in, people don't set out to hit somebody on the road or knock somebody off their bike, or if they're a cyclist, to cause an accident.
I've been resisting getting involved in this morning because I know it can sometimes appear pedantic, but from a RoadPeace perspective, and from our members' perspective, when we consult with our members, they genuinely, the vast majority, find the use of the word accident offensive. I mean, it's a great question, percentage. The absolute vast majority are not accidents. There is something that could have been done differently to prevent them happening.
Is it negligence, though? The thing is, if somebody sets out to go and stab somebody, that is an absolute crime. They've gone out with intent. Is there a... I accept this is challenging because if somebody's been the victim of an accident or a crime, they feel it strongly. I completely get that. But a crime, if somebody goes out to commit a crime knowing that's what they're going to do, that is absolutely a crime.
But if you behave in a certain way that an outcome is inevitable, then that should be a crime.
But there's a fuzzy line there, isn't there?
There is a line, and we draw it very clearly.
No, but there absolutely is. If you don't go out with the intent of doing anything, if you don't go out and behave properly, if you're reckless driving, etc., absolutely. But there are lots of road collisions where it is what I would call an accident.
Well, I'm afraid I strongly disagree.
You don't. No, fair enough. We're allowed to disagree.
Yeah.
I just know that if I was to go out and hit another car, I absolutely know it would be an accident because
it wasn't intentional, but it could have been avoided, couldn't it?
Not always.
Well, I think it.
Okay, I'll give you an example. Thank God nothing happened. I was driving at about 10 miles an hour out of a street in Westminster, and a 3-year-old, I imagine, or that sort of size, came tearing out from the pavement where I couldn't see them because of straight in front of the car. I mean, thankfully, I didn't hit him. But if I had done, I was going at a snail's pace. I had no intention of doing anything. The fault was absolutely on behalf of a 3-year-old. You can't blame a 3-year-old, or the parent for letting that child run. Do you know what I mean? The victim in that, let me tell you, was me. I was shaking all day. But that would have been an accident. There's no question about that. So that's why there are fuzzy... and I do mean this. There are fuzzy lines. There are fuzzy lines.
I mean, what you've just said is a very specific example.
Yeah, but there's lots of those.
Well, I think there are a vast number where people use the word accident and it could have been avoided. In the specific case you talk about,
I'm sure there are some.
maybe that's more of a grey area, and I will let you speak. I promise
Rory.
you. Well,
I don't want to talk over you, Nick.
Well,
you're doing an excellent job.
Well, on that note, I'll hand over to you. That's very kind of you, Gordon.
There are circumstances where the primary fault lies with someone who vulnerable, like you've just given, but there are circumstances where, for example, if you are actually driving at 20 miles an hour, coming out of where you were coming out from, a hugely populated area, there would be questions as to why you were driving at that speed. And if you reduced your speed, which goes back to why we're reducing speed limits in London, thankfully, then you've managed to avoid that collision because you were driving in a appropriately adjusted your driving to the conditions of the road. The Road Traffic Act is in place to hold people account for poor driving, and I understand what you're saying, Susan, and you voiced the same concerns as a lot of people in London, okay? But what you're doing is normalising collisions with how you're presenting that right now. Collisions generally, more often than not, can be avoided if you drove in accordance with the Road Traffic Act and the Highway Code, and quite frequently it is because people's standards of driving have fallen below the expected standard as to why collisions occur. I see all sorts of collisions with the work I do, mainly with cyclists, and British Cycling present all collisions pretty much to me for me to consider whether there is a civil case, okay? So I do see from time to time cyclists doing things and I say, you have not got a civil case here because you have done something which you have materially caused. The amount of those collisions I see are very rare in comparison to the amount of the collisions are caused by the poor driving mannerisms of a motorist, I'm afraid. I mean, if you say to me they came out of the blue or they rode in front of me, read the Highway Code, because quite often people don't come out of nowhere. They are there to be seen if you're looking properly, and not looking properly is a huge cause of collisions. And if people drove more considerately, then there'll be less collisions on our roads. That's the bottom line.
Okay. I drive a lot in London, and
so do I.
Yeah.
And I see very poor driving standards daily when I drive.
Yeah, so do I, by all people using all sorts of different modes. I grant you.
It's the causative potency of who causes the greatest damage to one another.
Okay. Well, on some elements we agree, on others we'll have to agree to disagree. But thank you.
Thank you. Now, I think this whole piece about crime, and I mean this has actually come into the sort of final question that I was going to be asking, and this is whether victims of serious injury collisions should be treated as victims of crime, and why that is the case, and what difference it would make if serious injury collision victims were treated as victims of crime. I mean, I think you've had, and Susan, thank you for bringing out that last piece of the discussion, because I think it is a really useful discussion to have, because we, I'm sure anyone who has driven has, caught themselves doing something where they think, oh, I shouldn't, that was could have been a catastrophic mistake. And there is a kind of I mean, I think one of you talked about the normalisation of these serious collisions happening on our roads, and the way that the word accident can just make it feel like it's, oops, that shouldn't have happened. And actually, if we all pause and think to ourselves, is there anything about my behaviour, whether we're the person crossing the road or whether we're the person riding a bike or whether we're the person at the wheel of a car, is there something about my behaviour that I could have changed? And if we're all really honest about those questions, then potentially, actually, if there's a more general awareness, we might actually be able to bring down those terrible numbers of people who are suffering really awful injuries that go on lasting throughout your life, and that's for the people who are lucky enough not to be killed in a crash. So I think my sort of, I'm going to join my two questions together for this last bit, but it's so. Is there, do you think there is a case for serious injury collisions to be treated as victims of crime? And is there something that you think that the Mayor could do to support victims of serious injury collisions in London? And we've had lots of good ideas throughout the morning for the sort of the leaflet, better communication and everything else. So if you could, in this last round of questions, just comment anything else on the issue of treating victims as victims of crime, and also what's the good idea that you want to really push? So I don't know who wants to start. Nick.
Happy to go first. Look, just to be very clear, from our perspective, yes, please treat road crime like a real crime. And one of the key reasons that needs to happen is if you are treated as a victim of crime, then you have the right to information and you have the right to support. And if it's not treated as a crime, then some of those rights just don't exist. I think what you were saying there was very interesting in terms of our behaviour. And look, you know, I walk, I cycle, I drive sometimes. I can be a little bit tribal. And I think we do have to think of everyone using the road network. And I think behaviour is a big issue, and I think that's an area that the Mayor could work to influence and change that. I think there are some other specific things from our perspective. As a very brief list here, I think information and signposting to various support services and all the various charities that are involved in supporting victims of road crime. So, you know, we've mentioned head injuries, brain injuries. There are a lot of very specialist areas, and I think that signposting needs to be improved. In terms of the police, we'll argue that a prioritisation and more resource, I mean, I'm sure you hear this a lot, but there's just not enough resource for this particular area. Better post-crash support, just to repeat, raising awareness, changing behaviour, and, you know, I completely understand that Vision Zero is an incredibly ambitious target, but it is the only acceptable target, and I think anything that the Mayor can do to renew energy and commitment to that. I mean, again, genuinely, I think London is leading the way in this area, but, you know, anything more that could be done would be appreciated.
Thank you. I'm going to bring Jami in online next.
Thank you. I think for me, there is an opportunity for a national piece of work that could be influenced at the very start by the Mayor. The Victims Code references victims of crime. It doesn't reference road victims specifically. If road victims were included in the Victims Code, I think the standard setting around communication and accessing support and all of the rights that victims of crime have would bring road victims in line with that. So I think for me that is the most central piece of change that could influence all of that.
Thank you. That's very clear. I'm going to go to the lawyers and then I'm going to come to Amy and Victoria. I'm going to give you the last word. So, Dushal.
I think just echo exactly what Nick and Jami has said. I think, of course, there needs to be an appreciation that road victims are victims of crime in the same way that, you know, knife victims are, and I think that will change perception. And I think we've discussed today the common issues between all of us, and I think there's consensus that training comes at the forefront of this, training in terms of checklists and minimum standards at the scene, training in terms of follow-up, and training in terms of what the minimum standards are in terms of communication with families and victims. So resourcing, in my view, towards training and having a national minimum standard is what I would push for.
Thank you. Rory.
I'd just like to appreciate actually what Susan was saying, and she was right, because there are situations where collisions are solely caused by the behaviour of someone. Vision Zero actually recognises that fact, that sometimes there are situations, but I don't have an actual percentage, but I can tell you in the work that I do, the large majority of the time, it is as a result of something else and not the actual victim. And most people don't go out day to day looking to be involved in a collision. I think we need to realise that. People are going to work, etc. They don't want to be involved in a collision, especially when you're a vulnerable road user. Granted, there are some people that do things that raise my eyebrows when I'm cycling to work, and I just think, what are you doing? But the vast majority just want to get from A to B safely. And when people are seriously injured, it really does devastate theirs and their families' lives, which is exactly why they need to be treated as a victim of crime, because the ongoing impact is huge to people's lives, not just for the immediate future, but for the long-term future, more often than not too. And Victoria is a prime example of her ongoing needs that she'll need for the rest of her life.
Thank you. Amy?
A few things. We've always said err on the side of compassion and treat every casualty as a victim of crime. And what are you talking about? You're talking about making sure they're kept informed of the investigation. Even offenders deserve that. We know there are support services out there that also offer help for offenders as well as victims. Two other things I wanted to mention. I would say please don't wait for a national solution or intervention. London can lead the way on this. They have in the past. I'd also want to say, follow up on Rory, our Vision Zero Action Plan is based on safe systems approach. And the core principle is that people make mistakes. So you might be responsible, you might even be criminally culpable, but it was never your intent. And that it is on the system designers to produce a system that if you make a mistake, it doesn't result in a death or a serious injury. So it should be really important for anyone working in TfL or the police to understand whether collisions are being caused by human error, lapses, or whether it's more risk-taking. And we haven't seen that yet, and not being reported. So I can't tell you what % are caused by criminality, but I think there is a difference with you're looking at preventing collisions.
Thank you. And Victoria?
Yeah, to answer your question and to pick up on what Jami said, the Victims Code of Practice, which is for all victims of crime, there was a mayor's question where the mayor confirmed that road crash victims are included within the code. But I think the issue is that if the investigation, like in Rory's case, is opened and closed within the same day, being kept updated and all of the things that you get under the Victims Code, that's not really going to apply to someone if the investigation is so minimal. So the key thing is understanding what level of investigation people should have. And one thing I just really would like to ask the committee, because when you speak to the police and Transport for London, they will say to you, when you say, okay, there's 3,859 people that have been seriously injured in London, they will say, yes, but a lot of those are people with quite minor serious injuries, so fractured ankles and things like that, which is true. There's a big breadth of serious injury within the serious injury category, so it's fractured ankles up to broken necks, someone needing care for the whole rest of their life. I don't have the data with me, but the police, when they attend a scene, they record it as either less serious, moderately serious, or very serious based on the injury someone sustained. And so we do know how many people suffered broken necks. They do know how many people suffered amputations, and then also how many people suffered some of the less serious injuries. And I think you'll be surprised as to how many people out of that 3,800 are suffering injuries that are going to impact the rest of their lives. And I would ask you to ask the police and Transport for London, because I think that's a key point. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And Rory?
Sorry, just a very short point following on from what Victoria said. Only today I was in communication with Marlow House, where there was footage of an incident that occurred, and thankfully they did prosecute the learner driver who didn't have someone in the vehicle with her at the time, driving in accordance with the licence and everything else. But they prosecuted her for careless driving, Section 3, when there is the new offence of serious injury by careless driving. And yes, our client got up and he sat on the roadside and it didn't look very serious. And the prosecution came 6 months later. And I spoke to the person at Marlow House today and I said, what communication did you have with the victim as to the severity of his injuries? Because his injuries are more severe than what was initially thought. And there was no communication, and that's why they proceeded on that basis. And if they'd spoken to the victim, they would have realised how serious his injuries were.
Yeah. Well, that example makes absolutely clear the importance of that communication and the communication with the victims, and that the victims deserve, as a minimum, that level of communication. I want to thank all of you for, and Jami online as well, for bringing yourselves and your experience and your knowledge of the whole post-crash system to our meeting today. It has been incredibly helpful to hear from all the evidence that you've all given us, and we will be absolutely taking it forward and raising many of the things that you have raised with the police and with TfL when we meet them later in this process. I also just want to raise that we have got a call for evidence out, and if anyone is watching online, and has experience of serious injury collision in London, we would very much like to hear from you, and we will make sure that we keep putting out communications with the link for on the GLA website for how to give us information, because it's really helpful to hear the experiences that people have had. So I've thanked our guests for attending. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion? Can we delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from the meeting? Can I ask the committee to note its work programme for the 23-24 Assembly year? The next committee meeting is scheduled to take place on Thursday the 14th of December at 10 a.m. in the chamber here at City Hall. And I have no urgent business, so that concludes today's meeting.
This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.